The Vatican is arguably the world's richest religious institution. Its paintings, basilicas, and priceless treasures rival the museums of great nations. Its bank quietly manages billions. As for its influence, it stretches from Wall Street to the most remote villages of the world. But there is a side to this that never crosses most people's minds. This empire of wealth didn't just drop from the sky, it was built. And like every great fortune in history, its foundations were laid not just with faith, but with money, power, and the kind of deals that would make believers' jaws drop if they heard them. This matter isn't about theology, friends. This is purely economics. Because the story of the Vatican's wealth is the story of how a spiritual movement turned into a colossal financial empire, and how money became the oxygen of religion. Everything started the moment Christianity was legalized. In 313 AD, Roman Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, legalized Christianity, and ended centuries of persecution. Overnight, that small group of believers living underground turned into a religion backed by the state. Once legitimacy arrived, the gifts started pouring in naturally. Aristocrats donated land. Emperors drowned the church in privileges and treasures. Constantine himself paid for the first St. Peter's Basilica. The message was clear: wealth and holiness could walk hand in hand quite nicely. And from that moment on, the Church learned the lesson every empire has long memorized. Money is power, and power needs money. By the early Middle Ages, the Church had already perfected its first great financial invention, the tithe. Believers were obligated to give 10% of their income to the Church, a steady stream of revenue flowing from the peasant's field to church coffers, then to bishops, and finally to the very top, to Rome. Just imagine. You are a farmer in the Middle Ages struggling to feed your family, but you have to give 1/10 of your grain to the church, or else the salvation of your soul is at risk. This wasn't charity or anything like that. This was a straight-up tax, sanctified by religion. And over the centuries, these taxes made the Church the largest landowner in Europe. By the year 1000, the Catholic Church owned nearly 1/3 of all land in Western Europe. Not just churches at monasteries, fields, vineyards, mills, forests. Real assets printing real money long before banks existed. But the story gets darker here, because land and taxes weren't enough to turn that giant wheel. By the 11th century, the Church discovered a new financial weapon: indulgences. The idea was simple. The marketing was simply genius. Give money to the Church and lighten the punishment for yourself or your deceased relatives in the afterlife. They were literally selling salvation for money. And it brought in incredible amounts of money. Indulgences poured gold into the Vatican's coffers in torrents, financing not just churches, but wars too. Because at that time, the Church wasn't just a religious institution. It was a geopolitical power. The Crusades, starting in 1096, are known as Holy Wars, but they were also a complete financial lottery. Armies needed money, so the Church imposed new taxes to cover the costs. To those who couldn't fight, they said, "You don't have to come. Just pay the money and get the merit." Cities were conquered, treasuries seized, and lands were claimed in the name of faith, but actually in the name of the papacy. When the Crusades ended, the Vatican held not only spiritual authority, but also military and financial power to rival kings. This is the most ironic part. While priests preached poverty and humility from the pulpit, the Vatican had become Europe's largest landowner and tax collector. While ordinary families listened to how great a sin greed was, The church was hoarding wealth no king could imagine. It's that classic pattern we see in every empire. Moral tales told to the public and money wheels turning behind the curtain. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, the Vatican had transformed from a landowner to a financier, and by the Renaissance into a center of money and politics. Popes were no longer just shepherds of souls. They were princes, lords, bankers. And like every ruler, they needed cash, not to feed the poor, mind you, but to feed armies, drown artists in money, and outshine rival kings. The symbol of this ambition was St. Peter's Basilica. The old church Constantine had built centuries ago was falling apart. In the 1500s, the popes wanted a massive, magnificent cathedral that would overshadow everything in the Christian world. But grandeur isn't cheap. To pay for it, the Vatican leaned even harder into the indulgence business. Preachers traveled inch by inch across Europe, selling those certificates that shortened the time spent burning in purgatory. The marketing was so shameless that Dominican friar Johann Tetzel's famous saying went down in history: "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." Poor peasants fearing for their loved ones gave everything they had, thinking they were buying salvation. But this money didn't just go to the church, it also went to the luxurious lives of the popes. Renaissance popes lived like kings. Alexander VI of the famous Borgia family turned the palace into a nest of nepotism, luxury, and scandal. Leo X of the Medici family buried money in art and feasts, while the people of Rome were starving. The irony was crystal clear. While greed was preached as a sin in sermons, the Vatican was swimming in wealth that would make kings jealous. Behind the scenes, the papacy had discovered a new instrument of power: banking. Officially, the church considered usury a sin. But under the table, popes formed partnerships with Italy's great banking families to multiply their wealth. The papal palace turned into a financial hub, managing not just church revenues but royal debts. Kings owed bankers, bankers owed Rome. The Vatican had become the spider right in the center of Europe's web of money and power. But every bubble eventually bursts. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther came out, nailed his 95 Theses to the church door, and said, "This indulgence business is a fraud." He shouted that salvation could not be bought, that the church had turned religion into commerce, and that Rome's wealth was earned on the backs of the poor. This protest started the Reformation and split Europe right down the middle. Those indulgences, once the Vatican's golden goose, suddenly became the symbol of corruption, and entire nations broke away from Rome. The irony couldn't be sharper. The very scheme that paid for St. Peter's Basilica, the apple of Catholicism's eye, also triggered the rebellion that shattered its monopoly on Christianity. Wealth had brought both grandeur and hatred is the only currency no empire can control. By the 1600s, the Vatican was still rich, but its charisma had been tarnished. It was no longer unrivaled. Yet the formula remained the same: faith in the window display, money under the counter. And like every great power, they adapted to the situation. Even if they lost half of Europe, they would find new ways to turn faith into a balance sheet. For centuries, revenue came from land and taxes. But in the 19th century, this empire cracked. In 1870, those vast lands directly ruled by the church were taken away by the newly formed Italian state. Overnight, the Pope was left without land or soldiers. The Vatican went from a landed empire to a spiritual one. And everyone thought, this is over, their money is gone. But history shows us this. Institutions built on money don't let go of money that easily. The comeback happened in 1929 with one of the most overlooked agreements of the 20th century, the Lateran Treaty. Mussolini, needing the Pope's support for his fascist regime, sat down with the Vatican. The treaty gave the Church sovereignty over Vatican City, but the real bombshell was this. A massive compensation was paid for the lost lands, cash 750 million lire and 1 billion lire in government bonds. Billions of dollars in today's money. The Church went from the brink of bankruptcy to instant wealth. This was literally a bailout package paid by a dictator in need of support. With this money, the Vatican built a new financial machine, the Vatican Bank. Its official name is the Institute for the Works of Religion, supposedly managing funds for charities. But in practice, it became a financial giant operating in the shadows, far from oversight. They funded anti-communist movements during the Cold War. In the 80s, they were right in the center of the famous Banco Ambrosiano scandal. Billions evaporated, and Roberto Calvi, nicknamed God's banker, was found hanging under a bridge in London, pockets full of bricks. His death was ruled a murder. Rumors linked the Vatican Bank to the mafia, intelligence agencies, and money laundering operations. These allegations haven't let go of them even today. The irony is so obvious. An institution preaching poverty and humility had come to outshine Wall Street firms in the dark arts of finance. They built wealth with land, resurrected it with deals, and then protected it with a wall of secrecy no one could penetrate. And despite all these scandals, the Vatican remained too holy to fail. Today, the Vatican's true wealth is a total mystery. Michelangelo's and Raphael's may not be saleable, but they are worth billions. As for their real estate and investments, it's a massive fortune hidden behind shell companies. Officially, they say, we have a modest budget. But anyone who knows history is aware. Appearance is just an illusion, and illusion is power's greatest tool. The moral of the story is this, friends. The Vatican's wealth didn't drop from the sky. It was built using the tools in every empire's toolbox. Taxes, land seizures, promises of heaven, secret deals, and banks. They grew by selling salvation, taxing believers, shaking hands with kings and dictators, and manipulating money flows just like today's corporations. This story isn't about faith. It's about the mechanism of power. And that's why it is still important today. Because the Vatican isn't the only example. Every system that tells you trust us while filling its own pockets plays the same game. Whether it's a state devaluing your money, a corporation talking about values while crushing its workers, or a bank gambling with your money while promising security, the formula is always the same: faith in the window, money under the counter. So, when you look at those gold-plated halls of the Vatican, don't just see religion. See the oldest lesson in financial history. Wealth accumulated in the shadows always wears a mask of virtue. And whenever you are told to blindly trust a system, don't forget to ask who really profits from that belief. They say history doesn't repeat itself, but if you don't understand it, it will run you over. If what I've told you has opened a new window in your mind, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. The answers are hidden in history. I'll show you where to look.